I think the basic principles are the same, as a teacher in a teaching as inquiry cycle, starting with the valued learning outcomes, and of course they're not just what the teacher values, but whānau, the school, the students, the community, all of that. But starting with that, gathering evidence about that, and then gathering evidence about your own teaching. And designing new approaches, and of course monitoring and evaluating them. The basic principles are exactly the same. There are differences though in how you look at the data when you're a classroom teacher working with 25 or 30 or 35 children, as opposed to school leaders who might be looking at data across 500 or 1,000 students. For one thing, as a classroom teacher, when you look at data, the data is not faceless. So it's not useful as a teacher to look and say, 10% of my students are having difficulty with this, when the 10% of students are Aaron, Nina and Rebecca, and you know who they are. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about percentages or aggregate like that. So I think it's really important that teachers continue to personalise the data and evidence. And the other big difference, I guess, is that for a teaching as inquiry cycle, the level of formality of the testing or the rigour is a bit different. You as a teacher, you want to be systematic, but you can use more informal sources of information, more anecdotal forms of information, and if you get enough of it and test it, then that'll help. The problem with anecdotal information is that you tend to notice what you want to see or hope to see or expect to see. So I do think anecdotal it's probably weaker than really what I mean, but certainly in terms of informal sources of data, I'd be talking to children a lot, and they're an underutilised source of information in schools and classes and in research. So the children will often be able to give very articulate explanations of what they think is working or not working so well. There's a whole range of formative assessment tools that are useful that teachers can use throughout the year. So, for example, schools are looking at ASTEL writing. There's assessment resource bank materials that are available from New Zealand Council of Education Research. There are tools like ASTEL, which you can use purely formatively and use small snapshot tests. Teachers can design their own assessments, and I think strengthened a lot if they will design them in collaboration with other teachers at the school and talk about the results together. I think there's never, in this kind of work, there's never a shortage of information. The key thing is to be really clear about what the questions are that you're asking. So keep taking everything back to the valued learning outcomes, because otherwise, in data and evidence, we can just totally lose sight of the forest for the trees. If our valued learning outcomes are, include, we want to improve students' attitudes and beliefs about reading, then hopefully, if you're clear about your question, then the source of information should get clear. So for that question, I would be thinking, if I want to know about beliefs and attitudes of students, then the best source of information is to be asking the students and to be observing students. Depends somewhat on the nature of the problem, because sometimes with a class you might have a problem that is it's always only ever going to be fairly, but you might have a problem that's fairly generalised across a class. Or you might have, within your class, you might have a group of learners who you're particularly concerned about, where existing practices are serving most of the kids pretty well, but there's a group of kids that it's just not cutting it. So it would depend a lot. It would depend a lot on that. There are of course issues and risks with a focus on priority learners, in the sense that sometimes might have an unintended consequence if those students realise that they are priority learners. You know, it might reinforce some of their own lack of self-efficacy and negative feelings about it, or if they perceive that other peers have identified them as needing special help. But I mean, those are decisions that teachers, every teacher has to grapple with on a daily basis anyway.